All right, well, looks like I'm starting. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about money, and money's kind of a weird thing to talk about. So really, what we're going to kind of get into is kind of currency theory and theory on currency and what money is. And before I would do that, I want to dispel one kind of a myth, and that is blind dog bumping into things. And that is that our money, the good old American dollar, is based on some kind of gold or some kind of silver or something like that. That there's some kind that dollar actually represents something of value. It doesn't, right? And that's okay. There's no reason why that's a bad thing. So don't anybody get all panicky and stuff like that yet. And I'm going to explain why. Now, historically, what we used to use paper money for, paper money was used to represent a certain amount of gold or silver that was in a bank or vault somewhere, right? And this is what we called the gold standard or maybe the silver standard, right? And what we would do, the idea behind that was that you had this paper money, and that paper money actually represented something of real value. Well, that's not how it works. And there's an awful lot of folks out there, especially now that the economy's starting to go south a bit. You're going to start seeing these folks say, "Hey, you know what? The problem is that the dollar isn't based on anything. It's what's referred to as a fiat currency. It has value because the state says it has value." And if it was based in gold, it would actually be based on something of value, and therefore would be a lot more stable. And maybe it would be a little bit more stable. But there's some really good economic reasons why we don't have a gold standard. There's some really, really good reasons why the dollar only was on the gold standard in the after World War II. The dollar was on the gold standard, but was taken off of the gold standard in the 1970s. Now, I'll give you an example here, all right? So let's say we have X number of dollars, right? We have X number of dollars. And these X number of dollars represents X number of gold. Let's use red to represent gold, right? Gold, 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 right? So, you have this currency, you have this dollar. Now, what you got to do is you got to get that currency, that money, into the hands of people who are going to spend it, right? So here's a person, and here's a person, and here's a person. All right? Now, this seems to work out pretty well. Each one of these people, they have the paper currency. That paper currency represents a certain amount of gold, and that's going to work out pretty well. Well, wait a minute. What happens when, say, this person meets this person and they fall in love? What are they going to end up doing? Well, what they're going to end up doing is they're going to make another little person, right? And that another little person, he's going to grow up to be a big person, and he's going to need some of this money, right? And maybe another person's going to come along, and they're going to need some money, right? But the one problem is that people have a tendency to reproduce, but gold doesn't reproduce, right? So you have a couple of options. You can either find gold somewhere, right? You can take gold from somebody else, right? That's always a good idea. Or what you do is you end up mixing the gold with something else, like silver, right? By metallism. You take the gold, you mix it with a certain amount of silver, and now you can expand your currency to make up for to compensate for the growing population. But that's kind of an arbitrary thing anyway, right? So if you're doing that, if you're just going to mix it with some silver and inflate the currency arbitrarily, then the chances are pretty good that the value of the gold and the silver is just as arbitrary as the value of the currency that you're using, right? And this was a huge debate. So in the late 19th century, there was a huge debate on this very, very issue, right? You had people who were insisting that the dollar be based in gold, right? And oftentimes those were your wealthy people. They were people who had investments. So they wanted that dollar to be based in gold because one of the benefits of that is the value of the dollar remains stable, or the value of the dollar improves as the value of gold improves, right? So, so the people who have investments, they want that because they invested money, and the money had a certain value, and that was great. But they want that money back that has the same value. They don't want to put out an investment and get paid back with money that's of lower value. That hurts their investments, right? But what about people who were in debt, like farmers in the Midwest who had to mortgage their homes and took out loans in order to get their crops in? Well, they had a bit of a problem, right? Because money, as the population expands, the money doesn't expand, so money becomes more and more difficult to get, and they have these loans, and it's harder to get the money to pay the loans, right? So the farmers in the West, they wanted what was called bimetallism. They wanted to expand the monetary base so that they could get money that they could then use to help pay off their loans, right? So this became a huge debate in the 19th century, and it all boiled down to an election between William Jennings Bryan, who was a Silverite, right? He wanted to have bimetallism. He wanted to expand and inflate the currency to make it easier for these farmers to pay their loans. William Jennings Bryan, he wrote a very famous speech, "They'll not be crucified on a cross of gold," and a fellow by the name of William McKinley, who was, for the most part, a gold bug, right? He was somebody who wanted the dollar to be on gold. And ultimately, this boils down to the election of 1896, and this was the most expensive election up to that time. Investors put tons and tons of money behind McKinley, and it worked. Bryan was very, very popular, but because of all of the advertising and all of the money that went into the election, McKinley did eke out a win. And it turned out this is one of those instances where it's better to be lucky than smart, because what ended up happening was shortly after McKinley, there was a huge recession in 1893. Bryan suggested that expanding the monetary base, expanding the amount of money that could get in the hands of individuals would be one of the ways of relieving that recession. And it turned out, actually, economically speaking, he was right. That was the best way. But McKinley wins. He's not going to expand the monetary base. He's not going to take the dollar off of the gold standard or add silver to the gold, right? Use that bimetallism. So now we're stuck, right? Well, it turns out that we had this brand new purchase in the 19th century. It was called Alaska. You may have heard of it. And folks, exploring in Alaska found this huge deposit of gold. And it turned out what ended up happening was that gold ended up getting put into the market, and because of that gold, we were able to expand the monetary base, and that actually helped to alleviate the economic recession that existed in the 1890s. Basically, the gold discovery did what Bryan was trying to do by expanding the amount of silver that went into the gold standard. It expanded the monetary base. Money was easier to get. People were able to pay back their debts and pay back their loans and start spending the market, and that got things going again. But that was pure luck. William McKinley got lucky and ended up getting credit for the turnaround in the economy, which he had nothing to do with. And he ended up getting reelected in 1900. In fact, actually, that may not necessarily be that lucky, because he gets reelected in 1900. About 6 months later, he gets shot and killed. So he gets assassinated. So maybe it wasn't all that lucky for him. Maybe he'd have been better off losing. But either way, what you see is a weakness in the gold standard, right? You need to be able to inflate your currency to compensate for your population. Here's another problem with the gold standard. Let's say you put your money in a bank, right? You put this money into a bank. Floop. This money represents X number of gold pieces, right? The bank then takes this and loans that money to somebody at 10% interest, right? So now that person goes out, he takes that money, he's got his money, He goes out there and he makes a business loan and makes an investment. The investment pays off, and he ends up paying the bank back with 10% interest. So he paid back this amount of money plus another 10%. Where's the gold coming from? Basically, he just created money, right? By paying back that loan, by charging interest and paying back that loan. We've got more money in the market. But wait a minute, does that necessarily translate to more gold? Where's he getting the money? Now, if we want to expand the economy, that money has to come from somewhere, right? It has to represent gold from somewhere, but where, right? Because, he makes the money. That must mean that somebody else lost. The only way this works is if somebody else loses 10% of their money so that this guy can pay 10% back to the bank. But economically speaking, that's a wash, right? There's no economic growth associated with that. And when you look at that in terms of the economy as a whole, you can't do it, right? You're charging interest, you're making money off of investments, but that doesn't necessarily translate to more gold. It just translates to larger numbers on a spreadsheet somewhere, right? So that becomes a bit of a problem. And another problem that we ran into in the 1970s was what happens if this guy is making purchases in another country, right? He buys a German car. Those dollars then go to Germany. Germany now is holding dollars, right, that it can then exchange for American gold. And that works out pretty well, but until there's more, once again, we're creating currency because we're charging interest, we're making interest on investments, and that money then builds up in other countries like, say, Germany, Japan, places like that. Now we start to purchase foreign goods, France, whatever. We buy champagne, that's money that's going to France, right? We buy a Toyota, that's money that's going to Japan. Well, now all those countries are holding currency that is valued in gold, but the United States doesn't necessarily have the gold to cover that currency, right? Because just because the currency expands doesn't necessarily mean the gold expands. So now what do you have to do? Well, you have to thin down the gold with silver, but then you're dealing with international arrangements and agreements and stuff like that, and that becomes a real problem. So this is a huge problem with the gold standard, and I'm going to end this video here, and I'll put this out. I know that on the lesson plans I don't have this video, but I figured that having a discussion about the gold standard and why the gold standard really isn't that great an idea in a modern economy. Maybe it worked it didn't even work for ancient Rome. Ancient Rome ended up watering down their gold standard. I mean, so really, it's been very difficult for countries, especially advanced economies, to juggle the gold standard. So what they did is they came off of the gold standard, and now what they do is they use paper money is basically fiat money, right? It has value because the state says it has value, and I will explain in the next video exactly how that works out.